Hi, Hughes history students, and welcome to Mr. Howe's class for Chapter 12, Section 4. So before we start going over the chapter, I'd like to share with you the objectives and the proving behavior, why it matters today, and maybe some connections to today that I'd like you to be thinking about as we go through this chapter. So here are the objectives. Here are the things that I'd like you to be thinking about as we go through the chapter and talk about things, learn about things. The main objective is to demonstrate an understanding of how Andrew Jackson's policies caused the economy to collapse after he left office and how that affected the election of 1840. The proving behavior is that I'm going to ask you to think about, can you list 4 economic problems that resulted from Andrew Jackson's war on the Second National Bank and other policies? So in terms of, if I were to have an exit slip to have you leave the classroom if we were back in class, that's what I'd probably ask to see if you could be able to look on your notes and see if you could list 4 economic problems. Why it matters today? Well, because the condition of the economy continues to affect the outcomes of presidential elections. Many presidents have won or lost because of the condition of the economy. And the connection to today is, do you think that the current economic condition of our country will have an effect on the next election? So think about that. We've talked a lot about President Trump and his reliance on the success of the economy. So do you think that the current economic conditions will have an effect on the next election? So let's go ahead and now let's think about what the text says. Okay, so now let's take a look at the chapter and go through some of the most important parts of it. So if you're looking at your book, you're looking at page 384. And the first page is about Nicholas Biddle, probably not a very important person to know for the average student of U.S. history, but Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Second Bank of the United States, comparable to, for example, Jerome Powell today, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But Nicholas Biddle did have a lot of power, just like Jerome Powell has a lot of power too. But Jackson didn't like the bank, didn't like Nicholas Biddle, felt that the National Bank really focused too much on helping northern manufacturers and not so much southern and western agricultural people. And so he turned on the bank. And if you look at page 385, there's a couple of things on there. There's a voice from the past, and I'd like to read that to you because it's Andrew Jackson's reason for why he vetoed the charter for the National Bank. And you know, a president, when he vetoes something, has to send back a list of objections, a list of reasons why he is vetoing an idea passed by Congress. And since the Congress favored the charter, he had to explain to them why he was vetoing the renewal of the charter for the Second National Bank. And this is what he said: "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. But when the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society have a right to complain of the injustice of their government." So, when you think about what he said there and the argument in that statement, you know, the rich get richer. Well, Andrew Jackson was a rich guy who got richer. So it's when he talks about the common people, he wasn't very common. What about the slaves that he owned? What about the Native Americans that he threw off their land and moved across the Mississippi? So there's some interesting examples of or some contradictions maybe you might notice in Andrew Jackson's statement. At the very bottom of page 385, I would like you to take a look at that political cartoons. Political cartoons have a way of expressing what at least some people thought at the time. And if you take a look at that cartoon, it's kind of hard to see because it's a small inset. but it does show Andrew Jackson with either a cane or a sword in his hand, and on the cane or sword it says veto. So it's expressing his veto power, and he's fighting against a multi-headed snake, which would be the Bank of the United States. And some of those people on there are Nicholas Biddle. Some of them are members of Congress that wanted the bank. And so you kind of get the idea that from the perspective of this political cartoon, this was written by someone who supported Andrew Jackson and his ability to veto the Second Bank of the United States, and kind of showing him either hitting or chopping at that multi-headed snake. So whenever you portray someone as a snake, you're usually portraying them as being something bad. If you turn the page and look at page 386, and on page 386 it talks about mostly what happens after Jackson leaves office, and how the times of prosperity that were happening under Jackson end up falling into inflation, and eventually there's a panic on money, and people rush to the banks with all their paper and money saying, no, I don't want paper, give me gold and silver. The banks don't have it, so they go out of business, and so that causes an economic depression. Once again, Van Buren takes the fall for it, but it really was the policies of Andrew Jackson, specifically the policy probably of getting rid of the Second National Bank, that caused this big depression. And from the anti-Jackson feeling that was around at the time, you have people who had been National Republicans. By this time, the National Republicans had faded away. So just like the Federalists faded away, the National Republicans fade away. And in its place rises the party that, and they call themselves the Whig Party. As I've said many times before, it has nothing to do with the hair that you put on your head. That would be spelled W-I-G. This is spelled W-H-I-G, and it refers to anyone who is anti-king. We know that Andrew Jackson was mockingly referred to as King Andrew for example, not executing or enforcing the law having to do with the Native Americans staying on their land, as the Supreme Court had said, and also for his getting rid of the National Bank, even though it seemed like that was something to kind of keep the economy in check. And so you have the Whig Party. And the Whig Party actually is very successful in terms of getting 2 presidents elected. Eventually, and when you look at the list of presidents, there's 4 presidents who were Whig presidents, but one of the reasons why there's 4 Whig presidents is that both of the Whig presidents who were elected as presidents die while in office, and their vice presidents take over. So there is a total of 4 Whig presidents. However, the Whig Party is only able to get 2 people elected to the presidency. William Henry Harrison is the first, and I think he's very interesting. His name is attached to probably the first famous campaign slogan. I mean, we've talked about campaign slogans in the past. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a campaign slogan that said, "I'm with her," meaning I'm on her side, voting for a female president. I always thought the most clever one, or there's 2 clever ones, Ted Cruz, when he was trying to defeat Trump for the Republican nomination, had that one that said, "Trust Ted," trusted, with the T-E-D on the end capitalized for his first name, Ted Cruz. But of course, my favorite one, I'm not saying I'm a big fan of his necessarily, but I always liked Bernie Sanders' slogan from 2016 where it said, "Feel the burn," talking about Bernie Sanders in that. So I thought that was pretty clever. But the first real clever campaign slogan was in 1840 with William Henry Harrison, who was famous for winning a battle that was part of the War of 1812 called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And because his vice presidential candidate was named John Tyler, they took his nickname, Old Tippecanoe, combined it with Tyler to basically say, vote for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So that's probably the first clever one that became popular at the time. And in 1840, because of the bad economic times, because Martin Van Buren took the fall for that, even though we can really look back at Jackson's policies, the Whigs are able to get William Henry Harrison and John Tyler elected. But on the downside for William Henry Harrison, he makes that speech in the rain on Inauguration Day in March, catches a cold soon after that, and it's hard to say whether or not the cold weather had that big of an effect on it, but he did catch a cold after his speech and died about 30 days later of, they think it was pneumonia or some type of viral infection. So, he's only president for 30 days, and John Tyler has to take over. And even though we're going to talk about it a little bit more when we go over the questions and answers, John Tyler never had a vice president while he's the president because the country was still so new. They didn't quite know what to do a lot of times, and there was nothing in the Constitution that said what happens after a vice president takes the place of a president because of death. And so Tyler serves without a vice president because the Constitution wasn't clear. Today we know that when a vice president becomes the president, by constitutional amendment added later, they decided that the new president then selects somebody to be the new vice president, but must get the confirmation of the Senate. Kind of just like when the president appoints a Secretary of State. For example, when Vice President Ford became the new president when Nixon resigned, Ford picked Nelson Rockefeller to be his new vice president, but Nelson Rockefeller had to be approved of by the Senate in order to get his job. So that's the way it happens today. So we'll never have a president without a vice president for very long. So now let's go over all the terms and names. You can see at the bottom of page 387 there were 7 terms and names you had to look up. There is using graphics that you have to add from this video. I will know if you did not watch this video, if you don't have the tree map I'm going to ask you to draw. And then of course there's the 3 main idea questions you're required to have. And for those brave people who did the critical thinking question, we'll also go over that. Okay, we've gone over the text, and now let's take a look at some of the important terms and names. So take a look at that list, and I know for periods 2 and for period 7 the digital textbook for some reason wasn't available for section 4, so this would be a great time for you to pause and to write down looks like there's 7 or 8 of the terms and names. That way you can still get full credit even though you didn't really have to look up anything in the book. And the first term is inflation, an increase in prices and a decrease in the value of money. Periodically our country goes through these periods of inflation. Martin Van Buren, the vice president of Andrew Jackson in his second term, and eventually becomes the 8th president, and really gets a kind of a bad rap for the terrible economy, even though he mostly wasn't responsible for it. But don't forget, whenever you're in charge, if you're the chief executive officer and things go well, you get to take credit. But even if you had nothing to do with it. And the opposite is true. If things go bad, even if you had nothing to do with it or no control over it, you sometimes take the blame. Panic of 1837 was a depression. We often talk about the Great Depression of the 1930s and into the 40s. But the Panic of 1837 was probably just as bad. There was even less of a safety net for the poorest and the most affected by the Depression. So because it's so long ago, that's probably why we don't focus on it, but a terrible depression in 1837. And what is a depression? A depression is a severe economic slump. It's characterized by banks going out of business, factories closing, people losing their jobs, homelessness. So that would be characterized by depression. There's an economic term which says it has to have a certain number of quarters of a downturn in economic activity to be considered a clinical type of thing in that type of economic term, depression. But just understand that depression is a severe economic slump. The Whig Party is also something that we just talked about by going to the text, and it was a party formed by the opponents of Jackson. They mockingly called him King Andrew because so many of his policies he got by acting like a king. And the Whigs, of course, were a group of people from Britain originally that were against royal activity, and the patriots of the American Revolution also called themselves Whigs because they were against King George. And so these people were against King Andrew, so it was a natural thing to call their party the Whig Party. It has nothing to do with the hair that people put on their head. Then you have William Henry Harrison, who's the 9th president, the first Whig president from that party. And he's probably most famous for dying right away. He makes that speech at his inauguration, and 30 days later he's dead from they assume some type of pneumonia or bacterial or viral problem that he suffered. May have caught it during his speech. We're not quite sure, but he's the president for the shortest amount of time, 30 days. And then it's the first time that a vice president takes over. So John Tyler is the 10th president. And what's interesting is that while he's the president for most of Harrison's presidency, there's no vice president because they weren't quite sure what to do. The Constitution was vague about what happens when a vice president does take over. And because it had never happened before, John Tyler is a president but does not have a vice president. A lot of students ask me, well, what would have happened if Tyler would have died? And that's a good question. I'm sure they would have made up something. But there's no good answer to that. Fortunately, he didn't die, and we didn't have to worry about that. But that's the terms and names. And now we get to the part where I will know whether or not, or at least have evidence that you watched this video, because the tree map that says cause of economic problems is something that is not in the section assessment. It's only on this video. So when you turn in your section assessment, you might get, in the future, you might get a lower grade on it if I don't see this tree map. And the tree map has to have causes of economic problems. And inside of that box, you should write depression, Panic of 1837. And then there's 4 details that go with describing the causes of the economic problems. And of course, this is part of that proving behavior. If we were in class, I might ask you to prove to me that you know this by writing this down on a slip of paper and giving it to me in the form of an exit slip. But anyway, so the details would be one of the causes of economic problems were this depression, this Panic of 1837. State banks issued too much paper money. Inflation, the rapid rise of prices. Banks went out of business when people got worried about their paper money and took it all back and demanded gold and silver in exchange. And the banks just didn't have it, so they went out of business. And basically, the nation's money system collapsed. So having a lot of bills didn't matter because the money was worthless. And so that would be the proving behavior that you could show to me. Yes, I do understand the objective. Here's my proving behavior. All right, and here are the answers to the main idea questions. If you're in periods 1, 3, and 4, this was part of your homework, and you feel free to pause and to add anything that's not in your work as we go through these questions. And if you're in periods 2 and 7, I don't know why it wasn't available on the digital textbook, but here's your chance to get the answers anyway. So go ahead and make sure you write the question and write down the 2 sentences which indicate what the answer is, and you'll get full credit even though you really didn't have to do anything on your own. So, feel free to pause at any time during this discussion so that you can make sure that you have the notes that you need for page 387, section assessment 1 through 4, chapter 12, section 4. So, on letter A, the question is, why did Jackson declare war on the Second Bank of the United States? And the answer that I'd like you to have is, Jackson considered the bank too powerful and corrupt. He thought it favored wealthy Northerners instead of the common man, and was also unconstitutional. So, in a way, Jackson was going back to Jefferson's argument with Hamilton about the first national bank, in which Jefferson argued and said, if it doesn't say you can do it in the Constitution, that means that you can't. And since it didn't say that the national government could start a national bank, in Jefferson's view, that means that you cannot. But Hamilton, don't forget, argued that, well, it doesn't say we can't form a national bank, and it does say that we can do everything necessary and proper for the carrying out of the other things it does say we can do. So maybe we can. So Jackson, of course, was agreeing with Jefferson on that issue. Doesn't say that you can form a national bank, so that means that you can't. So go ahead and pause here if you need to. On letter B, it talked about, well, how did Jackson actually kill the bank? Well, it's kind of complicated, but to make it simple, Jackson vetoed the renewal of the bank's charter, withdrew all federal money, and set up state banks that could receive this money. And in the book, it referred to these banks that Jackson put the money into as pet banks, kind of going back to, if you know what a teacher's pet is, these were banks that were friendly to Jackson. Eventually, the Second Bank of the United States goes out of business, and that's how he effectively killed the bank. Once again, pause right here, especially if your periods 2 and 7, so that you can write down the question, highlight the question, and then write the answer. Let's go ahead and take a look at letter C. The question is, what role did Jackson's popularity play in the elections of 1836 and 1840? And it says that the answer would be, Jackson's Vice President Martin Van Buren was his hand-picked successor and won easily in 1836. A popular president can generally have an effect on who should be their successor. In the election of 1840, a new party called the Whigs used a Jackson-like candidate, former General William Henry Harrison, to defeat President Van Buren. So just like in 1828, when the Democrats pushed Jackson as a war hero and a common man and, you know, a man of the frontier, the Whigs followed that same exact strategy, and that's part of the next question. So we'll leave it at that for question letter C. And so once again, pause here so that you can write down the question and write down a good answer to get credit for completing page 387 section assessment. And then we get to the critical thinking question. And that it kind of refers to something that I just said for letter C about what strategy did the Whig Party use in the 1840 election. Don't forget, this is not mandatory. You didn't have to do it. These are students that are going above and beyond and trying to earn that extra credit and that extra knowledge about American history. So the Whigs took their name from a term for the Patriots in the American Revolution and anti-king in England. The term applied to anyone who had been against the rule of King George of Great Britain. The term Whig was also applied to anyone who was against President Jackson. Many critics claimed he acted like a king, so he became nicknamed King Andrew. In the election of 1840, the Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, portrayed him as a war hero, which he was, and a common man, which he really wasn't. He was actually kind of wealthy like Jackson, in order to attract the same voters that Jackson had attracted. So now that we've gone over all the terms and names and main ideas and the using graphics question, let's go back and see, according to our main objective, I wanted you to understand how Andrew Jackson's policies caused the economy to collapse, and to prove that you could do that. For example, I might ask you to write a paragraph or make a list. So could you list 4 economic problems that resulted from Andrew Jackson's war on the Second National Bank, and hopefully you would rely on the notes that you took about the tree map that you drew about the cause of economic problems. Now don't forget, the only way you can get the tree map is to watch this video. You couldn't get it just by doing your section assessment at home. So hopefully you would identify the Depression or the Panic of 1837 as being the cause. And some of the details would be the state banks issue too much paper money, kind of like, checks. Inflation, which is the rapid rise in prices. Banks went out of business when everybody came back and wanted to cash in their paper money for gold or silver, and so people pretty much lost everything that was still in the bank. And eventually the nation's money system collapsed, and the paper money that had been issued was considered worthless. So those were 4 economic problems, and eventually, even though it didn't happen while Andrew Jackson was president, it happened while his vice president, who became president in 1836, most of the problems were caused by Andrew Jackson's policies when he was the president. So a lot of times a president makes decisions that leads to things that happen years later, and even though that person might not be president anymore, you can go back and say, wow, even though this president took the fall for this and got the blame, it really goes back to the economic policies of the previous president. And that's what happened to Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson is the one that had the war on the bank, closed the bank, and that led to a lot of economic problems. And now let's take a look at the connections to today. So think about, right now we know with COVID-19 and all of the stay-at-home, shelter-in-place orders, quarantine orders across the country, our economy has seemingly gone into the tank. So the question I'd like you to think about, President Trump has always played up the economy as being a reason for why he's such a great president. Now that the economy is not in such great shape, do you think people will say, oh, well, it's not his fault, it's COVID-19? Or will the fact that he is the chief executive officer, will he still have to take the fall for the current economic conditions? It's a great question to think about, and if you have any thoughts or comments on that, go ahead and feel free to email me, and I can send you back. We can have a little email discussion, or if there is some time for me to have a Zoom meeting with each period, that would be a great question if you had some really thoughtful things you wanted to say about that. We do know that President Trump really admires Andrew Jackson, and it's easy to see why, because they have a lot in common. They're both tough guys that kind of just say what they think and mean what they say. They just kind of appeal to the common person because they're probably saying things that a regular person might say. They're both used to being in charge and giving orders and having people just say yes sir and following those orders. So that's one thing you can say about Trump and why he likes Jackson, is that he's a tough guy. And Trump likes to think of himself as a tough guy, and so Jackson seems to fit that mold really well. On the negative side, we know that Andrew Jackson had very little sympathy for people who were not white. You can look at the fact that he was a slave owner. You can look at the fact that he went against the Indians on almost every front, and was mostly responsible for the removal of the Indians and the relocation to Indian territory, even though they had treaties and contracts with the national government, even though the Supreme Court said that the national government needs to honor those treaties. He went ahead and did it anyway. And Trump has been accused of being leaning towards the idea of white supremacy. So once again, there are some comparisons that can be made and contrasts that can be made for President Jackson and for President Trump. And I think that's one of the interesting ways that you can look at history, because sometimes you can see parallels between the past and today. So that brings us to the end of chapter 12. Section 4 was the final section in chapter 12. And Real quickly, I'd like to kind of summarize everything that we've learned about Andrew Jackson so far. So in the first section, the main idea was to understand Jacksonian democracy, the importance of the common man, the fact that a bigger population of people got to vote by allowing people, white males who were 21 who did not own property to be allowed to vote. The spoils system and the idea that to the victor go the spoils, and how Jackson, even though he didn't necessarily invent it, popularized the idea of giving federal jobs to people who supported him in being elected to office. Section 2 was mainly about Jackson's policy towards Native Americans and the sad and cruel way in which Native Americans were treated, how even if they won in the Supreme Court, as the Cherokees did, how Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling of the Supreme Court, and that led to Indian removal and the famous Trail of Tears. Section 3 was about the nullification and secession crisis in South Carolina, how that was kind of foreshadowing for what was going to happen later on when South Carolina tries to nullify a national tariff law. And it led to a lot of drama. It led to threats of secession by South Carolina. It led to President Jackson threatening any secessionists with being hanged if the crisis went on, and eventually led to a compromise tariff instead of the so-called tariff of abomination. And then Section 4 was about Jackson's battle to get rid of the Bank of the United States. So with those things in mind, and I hope that you have a better picture of Andrew Jackson, I have some good news for you. There's not going to be a test on Chapter 12 because we're right at the end of the chapter and we're about to begin spring break. So you don't have to worry about getting ready for a Chapter 12 test. I'm sure you're sad to hear that. However, I would like you to know when we come back after spring break on April 20th, all the work that we do is going to count for points. There will be chapter tests and quizzes about each section online, so those things will count. So I'm looking forward to seeing you guys after spring break, and I want you guys to have a nice, relaxing spring break, and I'll see you guys later. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell.